A pleasant morning to everyone. On behalf of the organizers of this webinar, the Foundation for the National Interest, Amador Research Services, and FACTS, we all warm installment of the Strategic Situationer series. For this particular webinar, we will be discussing Philippine foreign policy and the national security outlook and priorities. So everyone and all the good morning, magandang umaga, or good evening, or good afternoon, wherever in the world you are. First, we would like to remind all participants about the house rules for this webinar. Please kindly mute your Zoom accounts when not speaking to avoid disruptive noise. Second, participants who have questions may post theirs in the Q&A. With respect to time, I will collect the sent to the panelists accordingly. Participants are requested to virtually remain in the webinar until the end of the event. The webinar will be recorded and participants are not allowed to do so. So please, to our dear participants, please do not record any portion or the entirety of this webinar. Relate to the technical assistance of the webinar via private chat. And finally, please observe proper decorum throughout the sessions. Okay, with that, on behalf of the organizers, let me introduce our two speakers for today. We are very privileged to have them devote for today in discussing pressing foreign and security policy issues facing the country today. Our first, Amador del Rosario. Ambassador del Rosario is the 9th president of Miriam College. She's a distinguished career diplomat with an outstanding track record of 37 years in the Philippine Foreign Service, culminating her appointment as Undersecretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs. She has served in various capacities in Philippine embassies abroad, including Vienna, Singapore, and Washington, D.C. Her last appointment being as Philippine ambassador to India and Vietnam. Upon retirement, she was awarded the Presidential Medal of Merit. Ambassador, Director General of the Foreign Service Institute of the Department of Affairs, focuses on strategic studies and training of DFA personnel and an international perspective that will deeply enhance the school's academic offerings and expand external educational partnership as Miriam College's contribution to the development of national. Our second speaker is Dr. Gregory Winger, who is currently assistant professor in the School of International and Public Affairs of Cincinnati. In cybersecurity, U.S. foreign policy, and security studies, his research examines security cooperation, and in particular, how collaborative activities like defense have used to facilitate cooperation on emerging security issues. He has authored several works on these topics in publications such as Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, and Armed Forces and Society. Been a recipient of numerous prestigious awards and fellowships, including the World Politics and Statecraft Fellowship from the Smith Richardson Foundation, the Leifer Erickson Scholarship. And he was also previously a Fulbright Fellow in the Philippines. But before we give floor to our two respective speakers, may I kindly invite Vice Admiral Alano to give his welcome remarks.
Thank you, Aris. Distinguished guests, our esteemed speakers, fellow Filipinos of a maritime nation, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Foundation for National Interest and our co-hosts, Fox Asia and Amador Research Services, good morning, and welcome to our second event of the Strategic Situational Webinar Series. The series aims to explore the Philippines' national security posture from a variety of perspectives. involving its stakeholders, which includes members of the academe, government and non-government organizations, with a goal of concrete policy options that takes advantage of the opportunities and addresses the challenges in the global and regional security landscape. A Philippine study conducted at the height of the pandemic in 2020 found primarily the COVID-19 pandemic, followed by terrorism and communist insurgency as the top three most concerning security threats for the Philippine strategic community, by a slate of other security concerns in order of their importance, namely food security, natural human disasters, external territorial defense, transnational crimes, cybersecurity, disinformation and fake news. The COVID-19 is the major disruptor to global stability. The international economic condition, creating a myriad of challenges that stalled global economic growth, disrupted the movement of people, affected the supply chain, and highlighted the great power competition between the United States and the People's Republic of China. Opening discussions on a new Cold War, which heightened security tensions in the region, having Taiwan, the East China Sea, North Korea, and of particular concern to the Philippines and ASEAN, the South China Sea, as flashpoints in the region triggered by China's assertiveness and wolf warrior diplomacy. The Philippines continues to deal with internal security issues, a communist insurgency that has been going on for over 5 decades, and a radical fundamentalism movement that has created chaos in Mindanao with incidents such as the Marawi siege in 2017 and has continued to be sustained with acts of terrorism to kidnap for ransom and piracy in the country's southern border. For most Filipinos, the People's Republic of China continues to be the main external security issue. The swarming of Julian Felipe Reef incident with maritime militias and the water cannoning of a supply vessel headed for a Union shoal just last year reinforces this concern. These issues stalled efforts to draw new energy resources in our maritime entitled areas under a bleak backdrop that the Malampaya offshore natural gas project is soon to be depleted. Domestically, the Philippines continues to grapple with complex layers of insecurities, most prominently the COVID-19 pandemic. This has caught governments around the world by surprise, scrambling to come up with solutions to mitigate the rising cases of infection while trying to balance the economy. The Philippines is no exception, being badly struck and facing multiple gaps and deficiencies in the health, which is aggravated by the detrimental effects of nationwide lockdowns. Such effects includes the findings of the Philippine Food and Nutrition Research Institute, which showed that more than 60% of Filipino households experience moderate to severe food insecurity in 2020. The West Philippine Sea, together with environmental degradation due to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, reclamation, and marine pollution, as well as climate, were contributing factors. as we are increasingly made dependent to the internet and social media for our day-to-day needs, as well as for our social well-being and mental health, the newest and major threat of cybersecurity and fake news is another security issue that affects the daily activities of Philippine society and would require utmost attention, particularly with a forthcoming presidential election, where unscrupulous actors with ill intention would surely try to exploit. With the presidential election in just over a couple of months away, the next administration grave domestic issues, particularly the health and socio-economic impact of COVID-19 pandemic, as well as prevailing internal security concerns, and would have to navigate the country through foreign geopolitical conditions. Today's strategic situational webinar with its theme, Philippine Foreign Policy and National Security Outlook and Priority, hopes to discuss possible strategic approaches which the next administration may undertake that are practical and prudent, and that would at the same time bring forth the maximum contribution to the attainment of the Philippines' national interests and for the protection and security of the Filipino and their well-being. Once again, welcome to the Strategic Situational Webinar on the Philippine Foreign Policy and the National Security Outlook and Priorities. And let us all look at vibrant, interactive, and worthwhile discussion. I bring you back to ours.
Thank you very much, Vice Admiral Alano, Chairman, Board of Trustees of. I've already introduced our two distinguished speakers. So may I now pass the screen, quote unquote, to Ambassador her presentation.
Okay. Thank everybody, and thank you, Aris, for the introduction. You know, the opening remarks of Vice Admiral Alano somehow makes my presence here unnecessary. He covered all the important issues that we need to talk about, and as he was doing his presentation, I started to delete most of the stuff that I also wanted to touch on. Nevertheless, let me start by saying that perhaps it's about time that the Philippines really does its own national security planning and strategy on a long-term basis. You know, it's not because we're planning to move on to a new administration that we're going to do this, but perhaps we should really plan something so that whoever and whenever we change our leadership, we will be moving in the right direction. I'm going to approach, therefore, my presentation from the lens of economic issues. Vice Admiral Alano started to think about food security and the other disasters that have been besetting us. And I think if you have to look at the long term, really, we have to start with the main big issue in the world, which is climate change. I mean, whatever happens now, they said that it's really climate change that could destroy the world as we know it, in addition to a nuclear war, which is also something we have to worry about. That this is so important, change and weather patterns are really changing. Look at the economic situation, not only locally but globally. We just have to monitor investors. For instance, BlackRock, which holds a 3 trillion fund worth a 3 trillion investment fund. They have decided not to invest in anything that will really impact on climate change. So nothing polluting, and nothing that will make the world a worse place to live in. So it looks like really the investors are not just looking at the sustainability of the planet and and the people, but they're really looking at the sustainability of their portfolios. Because if the areas they're investing in are being affected unnecessarily because of climate change, then their investment portfolio also suffers from unsustainability. Now, if you also look at how investments have started to be shaped, we just have to look back in 2013 when there was flooding in Bangkok and Jakarta, if you remember those. It really disrupted the global supply chain, especially in car manufacturing. Even the car production in Japan was also affected because the parts were coming from Thailand. And we know that Thailand is the ASEAN car production center. Um, I mean, Thailand is the center for Asian car production. And so they saw that. And so later on, the investors started to think that they would invest only in places where there's no threat of flooding, where there are safer areas where they could put up their factories. And because of this, the Philippines mapped the whole Philippines and came out with a project called Noah's Ark. And it's supposed to guide developers and political leaders on which areas needed some kind of disaster risk mitigation. And I hope our political leadership, both national and local, will look at this, because it will not only be for the sake of inviting investors and inviting production facilities, but also for our own people. Because, every time our people go through a disaster, they become poorer because then they have to, um, what they call that, scrape additional resources to rebuild their lives. And at the same time, when we're looking also at our own investment strategies and attracting investors, we also have to look at the technology aspects of it. As I said, we have become somehow a center also for outsourcing. We supply certain parts of certain products, but now some businesses are already starting to think of the 3D printer, meaning you go to a supplier and he prints, he produces the part that you need. So this will really remove the need for those big production factories for this supply, especially let's say car parts or whatever parts we need. They will be produced right there at the vendor. So again, this will go into what we call which jobs now can we attract come to the Philippines. The past year, BlackRock, as I said, already made a policy which has influenced other investors. So their first action really was to withdraw from the coal mining industry of Australia. And so now there's really like a coal less energy if possible. And you know that Japan also decommissioned around 30 nuclear reactors, and Germany will shutter 3 nuclear reactors. So energy is going to be an important problem. Unfortunately, I think there are some sectors in our society that are planning to revive the Bataan nuclear power plant. And we don't know how this will go, because in Japan they need the approval of the citizens around the nuclear reactors before they can restart them or maybe put up new ones. But definitely Japan has, as I said, closed of our areas are the actors in the global arena. I think we have all been monitoring Russia, and somehow because of the action of the Russian military forces in in a part of Ukraine, the separatist side of it, the price of oil has gone up. The last time I read was 2 days ago, it has gone up to $97 per barrel. And people said that it could go higher than $100. And we all know that when oil was priced at more than dollars about maybe 10 or 14 years ago, it really slowed down the global economy. So we really have also to look at this. And perhaps this is where we really need to go into really encourage our alternative sources and our energy mix. Now, the other reason also why people are worried about Ukraine is that it might go beyond the separatist area, and Russia might also move, in the main areas of Ukraine. And there have been talks about Russia forming again a confederation of Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia. And so people's attention, at least for those who know their history, are going into Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad used to be Königsberg during the Prussian Empire, and it's situated between Poland and Lithuania. It's 1,200 kilometers away from the borders of Russia. So people are wondering, will Russia also march towards that area and connect it to the new confederation? And will it cut an area across Poland or even Lithuania? Fearing, of course, raising fears among the European Union and NATO partners. So now they're trying to look at their own military resources. And the reason why I'm raising this is because whatever happens in the European Union and NATO will definitely affect the attention of the US. The US will pivot again to Europe because policy, its economy, its politics, and everything that stands for is really mirrored in the European Union and in the values of the Europeans. So pivoting to Europe, of course, will mean a competition for the Indo-Pacific region. And we were just discussing 2 weeks ago about the growing presence and involvement of the US in the Indo-Pacific region, and that somehow it is an encouraging move for countries in the region, because we know that the the Quad, as we say, the presence of the Quad, we hope will somehow lend some kind of stability in the SCS area. Now, there's also the things that we have to worry about. I mean, Vice Admiral Alano referred to the terrorists, and our own insurgency movements, which have been going on for more than half a century. With terrorism, this is something that I'm not familiar with. I mean, the situation in the Philippines, but at least we know just from the news that it's really affecting our own development, because anything that really contributes to the absence of peace in a country really distracts everybody. And not only that, it siphons really the needed resources that we need to develop, not only our education and health. And we're talking about COVID-19. Can you imagine if you have to spend resources in addressing all these insurgencies and these terrorist actions? Then we are really getting much needed resources from the urgent needs that we have right now, which are really focused on health and education. And then, of course, we have also to think about our own role in the region. How much are we willing to invest really to promote our alliances? Whenever we talk about protecting our borders and protecting the region, how much are we willing to spend in terms of our own human resources, in terms of our own finances? Because I think our allies would expect us also to be part of those who will carry the burden, so to speak, because we cannot always be dependent on them. And then we also have to talk about, how the next presidency will be, because we know that the leadership either dampens or inspires confidence in a country. So will the next president improve investments, or will his or her presence discourage investments? That's also very important, and I hope that more and more of our people will think of that that they will just not just think of certain, narrow values that they're looking at, not the personalistic approach to politics, but really look at our own national development agenda. And of course, as Vice Admiral Alano has also mentioned, the threat of technology. We know very well that our minds, our perception of things can really be modified by how news come to us. Unfortunately, we don't have many fact checkers in our media, or perhaps there are some in the mainstream media and even in the social media that are really manipulating our own attitude towards our country, our leaders, and ourselves. And to me, this is the biggest threat of all, because if there is or there are foreign entities that are involved in this, then they will really undermine our democracy. And to me, that's the greatest threat of all. Our democratic way of life and the way we choose our future, they will be compromised because of the way we are being manipulated by algorithms and also by what we call the social media misinformation. These are just some of the things that I wanted to talk about. I think if there are more areas to be discussed, I can discuss them during the Q&A portion. And besides, as I said, I'm just taking off from where Vice Admiral Luis Alano stopped. Thank you very much and good morning.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Del Rosario, for giving us a very broad overview of the linkages between economic policy, foreign policy, and security policy. You are correct that there is a need for long-term security planning that incorporates all the many linkages between all these analytically disparate, but they're pretty much interwoven issues that affect our strategic situation in the Philippines, in the region. May I now invite Dr. Winger to give his remarks?
Good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. I want to begin by just thanking you all for the opportunity to come and speak to you today. The past 2 years throughout the pandemic have been extremely difficult in many ways for all of us. And as trying as that has been, the ability to participate in these kind of web forums across time and space, I think, is a real advantage. And I'm incredibly grateful for the hosts, for the co-panelists, and truly honored to be here amongst such esteemed co-presenters. I'd like to kind of frame my comments more and focusing on the US Philippine Alliance. This is a primary area of research for me along with cybersecurity. And I think it's a really critical point in the alliance's development, and when we think about both its past and its future, and the important steps that are necessary to help address what that alliance is. International security in general is undergoing a unique evolution right now in the 21st century. The definitions, the concepts which we knew and which we developed and which we applied throughout the 20th century, and which were the founding concepts of many of the key institutions, including the US Philippine Alliance, those are starting to become dated. And the question is now, what steps do we need to take to develop these alliances, develop these institutions, develop these capabilities to address modern and emerging security challenges? To begin with, it's hard not to think about, or at least talk about the alliance without reflecting on the experience of the past 6 years. It's obviously been a time of trial within the alliance. It's been very dramatic, even by US Philippine standards. And yet for all of that trials, all those difficulties, I am rarely, and this is kind of unique for political scientists in general, especially security studies, but optimistic about the situation. As difficult and as trying as these past few years have been, it's a good illustration, it's indeed data, it's evidence that the US Philippine Alliance isn't just an accident of history. It's not outdated, it's not obsolete, but continues to have value. As much as the current situation is often talked about either specific agents like President Duterte, or especially political actors like China failing to decouple the Philippines from the United States, I think it's much more important to emphasize that this isn't just about other people failing, it's about the alliance itself succeeding. That time and again, during periods of trials, in, for example, the 1970s, the 1990s, and now in the 2010s, there have been major questions raised about what is the value of the US Philippine Alliance? Is this a sound reflection of the national interests of the Philippines and of the United States? And does this institution that was created 70 years ago still have value? And based on the experience of the past few years, we can say categorically yes. That is exceptional, right? We don't often have that kind of affirmation that key institutions. We have clear evidence of an alternative paths being tried and having those not develop the returns that were necessary. Does that mean the alliance is perfect? Absolutely not. But it does very clearly establish that the US Philippine Alliance does have a role in 21st century security. The question then becomes, okay, now we know it has value. It has meaning, it has substance. What is that though? And this is where I think the alliance and where Philippine foreign policy, national security, and the United States as well has some really difficult questions to answer. Obviously, a lot of this hinges on what happens in the upcoming election. The next president will have a huge say in how these questions are addressed. What's the future of that relationship? But as again, just building on an excellent point made by Ambassador Rosario, is we need to start thinking about this not in terms of one president to another president, not in terms of 1 year or 2 years, but long-term strategic planning. And what does that long-term strategic planning mean for the alliance? I feel that the greatest potential threat to the alliance is complacency. That just frankly, we've seen threats, there have been internal threats, external threats, kind of dealt with those now, so clearly everything's okay, but not everything is okay. We need to actually think through what is the value of the alliance, what is its purpose, what is it supposed to help us achieve, and how do we build and put in place the capabilities, the institutions, the practices to help us do it, and then to do things, to translate talk into actions. And it's for this reason that I feel a lot of the criticism, especially leveled by individuals like Secretary Lorenzana of the alliance and of its role, is essential. It's not that the alliance is useless, it needs to undergo an evolutionary process to identify new and emerging areas from climate change, global health, and especially cybersecurity, where it has value, where it has use, and develop the mechanisms to respond to that. That is particularly true in the emergence of things like gray zone threats. When the MDT was written in the 1950s, an external attack was obvious. It was in the middle of the Korean War, World War II had just happened. An armed attack was conventional military threats, people in uniform crossing borders. Over the past decade, 2 decades, we've seen the growth, a significant growth of gray zone threats in the form of maritime militias, little green men in Ukraine, and cybersecurity. That clear threshold of a foreign armed attack is blurred now. And the question we need to think about is how does the alliance adapt to address these issues? And I think this is most clearly evident in an area that's very dear to me, and that's cybersecurity. I hope sometime, hopefully in the near future, we'll stop having to separate that as cybersecurity. One of the things we're seeing in Ukraine now is that the difference between traditional security, international security, and cybersecurity doesn't exist. All security issues are now cybersecurity issues. This is a key essential element of how states conduct themselves, how conflicts unfold, and it's just security. It's national security, full stop. Also an issue for the US Philippine Alliance. In particular, we need to start figuring out what is the role of the alliance. Would a cyber attack on either the Philippines or the United States constitute an armed attack under the MDT? North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, has specified clearly that it does, based on their determination, especially following the 2007 cyber attack on Estonia. NATO has undergone a significant review process and said that yes, a cyber attack can violate their treaty and lead to a collective defense response. Does that same logic apply to the Philippines? And if so, how do we start building out that capabilities? How do we, if we say that this is an alliance issue, that this is a security issue, well, now we need to match that with actions, with capabilities, and developing them. And one key element that I've learned through studying of not just the US Philippine Alliance, but all alliances, is that there's a lack of automaticity. Things don't just accidentally happen. It's not some, and now all of a sudden the alliance can do these new activities. It requires conversation, it requires decisions, it requires investments, actions. And so we need to think through what that is for new areas of security, and especially cybersecurity. I think there is a lot of potential for cooperation in cybersecurity undertakings. For example, existing defense diplomacy programs can be leveraged and adapted to address cybersecurity threats. For example, there are regular exercises in which the United States and the Philippines work together on disaster response, floods, typhoons, that kind of thing. And they've had amazing success, absolutely amazing success in disaster response. That same kind of mantra, that same kind of approach is also useful for cybersecurity. If you can simulate a joint disaster response to a typhoon, why not a ransomware attack on critical infrastructure? Develop that idea, practice it. And so when it happens, those relationships exist, that knowledge base exists, and actually the alliance will itself exist in this space. We can actually see that through existing defense diplomacy programs, through exercises. For example, my home state of Ohio, we regularly hold an annual training exercise in cybersecurity with our partners in Hungary and Serbia. There's no reason why the Philippines can't do that with its state partners in Hawaii and Guam. But it's also about looking at cybersecurity as a complex threat environment. I actually wrote this down. Something Admiral Alano mentioned. I thought it's just a brilliant phrase, and something I think captures the current security environment and cyber in particular, a complex layers of insecurity. That is cyber to a fault, because there are so many different layers of insecurity stacked on top of each other, from private sectors, supply chains, to human factors. It's not just a military response, it has to be a whole nation response as well. It's not just about Department of National Defense, AFP, and the US military, but needs to be Homeland Security, DICT, building out these new cooperative relationships in between new institutions that focus on cybersecurity, to learn from each other, to identify best practices, to share those best practices, and to start engendering norms of cooperation in emerging security fields like cybersecurity. And lastly, I'd also emphasize the essential need of education. Cybersecurity is not going away anytime soon. And the key obstacle here is training people, human capital, to identify things like disinformation networks, to help avoid simple errors like poor passwords, to instill good cyber hygiene, and especially to develop people who, in the midst of a crisis, in the midst of an incident, can respond accurately. That requires rethinking core educational institutions. It requires developing new educational programs on things like how to be a literate media consumer on social media, critical thinking skills, and especially adding to that technical and cyber training skills, not just for, say, college students, but for everyone. Good cyber hygiene, actual workforce development, so that as we develop these new threats, we develop keen areas of response. That's at least a good introduction to some of the things. I'm very much looking forward to questions and happy to discuss this further. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Winger. You did mention a lot of salient points about the importance of alliance management with the United States as a key strategic issue for the Philippines in the coming years. You also put the spotlight on the importance of cyber insecurity in the Philippines, and how this type of insecurity reveals a complex, multi-layered situation. And I think, given the pandemic, a lot of us in the Philippines have increasingly relied on online transactions and dealings. And I've heard a report that we have received around one count of Kaspersky is like 50 million attempts or attacks on our cyber infrastructure. And I do think that the next administration after our elections in May need to focus on the importance of attending to cybersecurity threats just as much as, if not, that would be ideal, with more traditional security threats. So given that the remarks of our we've heard the remarks of our speakers, I invite our participants to type in their questions. I will be able to read them to you, read them and ask them, relay them to our two speakers. Please type in your questions and we will gladly use them as points of discussion. As we wait, normally this is what happens in a webinar. Our participants don't have any questions yet, and I think the questions will surface sooner or sooner, not later. I want to start with questions for Ambassador Del Rosario and Dr. Winger about given all these security threats. And I think one thing that at least the two previous administrations have done is make sure that a national security policy somehow lays out the many strategic security and even what we would call non-traditional security issues laid out in terms of policy. So if you would be able to imagine what could be the elements of the next national security policy of the Philippines, what would be things that are going to be new or going to be highlighted then that were not necessarily highlighted by previous iterations of the national security policy? Maybe we can start with Dr. Winger, and then Ambassador Del Rosario.
Yes, thank you. So the easy answer for that is cybersecurity for me, but I think it's more important than just cybersecurity as a full stop. One of the things that's essential to think about is cybersecurity is a means. It's not necessarily the actors. And so it's identifying key groups, especially foreign state actors, and how they could use their existing agendas and translate them into through cyber means. So I think part of it is the current national security policy does an okay job identifying threats, but not necessarily the means. And that's where cyber can come into it. And also with that is recognizing the importance of a greater whole of nation approach that, especially in this era of pandemics, climate change, and cybersecurity, it's not just government resources. You need to engage populations, you need to engage private sectors into a new cooperative approach. And that's very different from traditional security issues.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Ambassador Del Rosario?
Yeah. Yes, I agree with Gregory, because I think, you know, every time we look at a problem, we always look at it from a particular silo. Our government should really learn to work together, you know, and also not that with the NGOs, with the private sector, because sometimes we just hear the voices from one side, we don't see the effects on the other. That's why, to me, I always see education and information as really essential, because the more we educate our people and the more we inform our people about what is happening around us, and really focus on things that are really needed for us to survive as a country and as people. Because right now, I think sometimes we tend to minimize the things that beset us now. And I think Greg mentioned about cybersecurity. So to me, our use of social media, our mainstream media are important because they're also tools of educating our people. And of course, I think we really have to look at how we can protect our environment, because um, we are really in the top three, certain countries on climate change. They say that migration and even instability will happen because of this climate change events, and our country might become unlivable if we don't do something about it right now. We should not reach the point of no return. Thank you.
Right. I think those two are mentioned in the current national security policy, but they're often located at the tail end, and after an exposition of the really more traditional hard security issues. But I think what both the ambassador and Dr. Winger is saying is that there needs to be more recognition that the future security threats of the Philippines will not come from traditional sources. But since these threats really will really affect the lives of many, if not all, Filipinos. We have a few questions on cybersecurity. I want this to be addressed by Dr. Winger. One question has something to do with what are the potential issues of cyber threats coming from China that the next administration should pay attention to. And I think related to that is, if cybersecurity threats or the sources of cyber insecurity are not addressed, what would be the adverse effects on the Philippines? So I think Dr. Winger can address this, but Ambassador Lula, if you have anything to add, you're also welcome to give your response. Dr. Winger?
Yes, thank you very much for the question. I'll start by focusing on the China issue first. China is a very, very, very advanced cyber actor. And one of the things we've seen in its active behavior is it prioritizes potential. China is not Russia. Russia, as soon as it develops a attack vector with piece of malware, it tends to use it pretty aggressively, especially on Ukraine, something we're seeing right now. China, however, has advanced cyber capabilities, but for example, we don't see the attacks on critical infrastructure that we see Russia kind of conduct, or that Iran will conduct. Instead, the threat of from China tends to be kind of threefold. The first and most important is espionage. China is world-class and then some in cyber espionage, and that's stealing political intelligence, and it's stealing economic intelligence, intellectual property. That's the number one threat. That's where the most active and more active than truly anyone else. That has been very active in the Philippines for a long time, of Chinese advanced persistent threat groups, APTs, they're targeting and using cyber espionage techniques to gain intelligence, and especially to gain data. Beyond that, one of the emerging areas that we're seeing is China's growth in information operations. The use of social media and manipulation, things that they are actively learning from Russia's use of disinformation. China is starting to develop those capabilities and starting to use them. They actively meddled in Taiwan's last presidential election. There have been coordinated fake social media accounts, one from China, identified in the Philippines. Is a capability that China is starting to ramp up, and I think that's important because it's one thing. It's not just like China has used incentives, like especially economic incentives, to try and win friends. It has used threats to try and win over potential adversaries. We are now seeing a growth of subversion as a new tactic, using cyber as a means, and social media in particular. The last one I would say is, just because China has not historically conducted attacks on critical infrastructure doesn't mean it won't. And you always need to be aware of that potential threats and take steps to raise barriers to prevent that from happening. Make things difficult. Things are going to get a lot worse. We've seen a staggering growth in ransomware attacks, especially based on attacks on critical infrastructure. It's gotten much easier. Right now, that's largely been targeting the United States and Europe, but that's very much coming to Asia, and it's very much coming to the Philippines. On top of that is the loss of data, threats of the theft of intellectual property, and you'll also have the growing risk of not just non-state actors using that, but North Korea is terrifying in terms of how they use cyber as a very aggressive, very opportunistic means to raise money. It's basically a state, what is a nation state that is using cyber theft capabilities to steal cryptocurrency and extort money, and that's something that can very much target the Philippines. Beyond that, I'd also highlight the threat of disinformation, the erosion of democratic norms. I think that's a major one as well, and that's a very difficult one to tackle. Thank you.
Aris, I think in my presentation, I mentioned about the role of technology in our lives, that somehow the democratic system could really be undermined by, you know, an unfriendly use of technology. And I think we're aware already that there are some infrastructure in our government or in our economic system that are under threat. We're talking about telecommunications, you know, energy. And if these will fall under the control of an unfriendly country, definitely we can suffer from what I call choking. You know, there are many ways of destroying an economy, and people talk about choke points. You can choke a seal line of communication. You can choke the supply of energy, just as what Russia has been doing to Ukraine, especially when the gas pipeline passes through there. So cybersecurity presents many choke points that can really upend our economy and our politics. That is the leadership. It depends on how our leadership view this. Because if you have a leadership who is more or less not too caring about this and thinking that it doesn't matter, I mean, I'm talking about that, will it matter to him or her whether we become a client state or not? And definitely I keep on talking about what are the core principles that we want to protect, so that at least based on this, we can really design our national security priorities for the next 50 years if necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are other questions on cybersecurity, but I want to pivot to a question by Mr. Mark Locsin, and I want to give also some back. I want to connect it with the current crisis in Ukraine right now. There is this idea that that what is happening in Ukraine right now is the fault of the West. That this is a crisis that has been conjured not by Russia necessarily, but by the West, that it's their fault of the US. Is this something that you can give your opinion on this, but I want to connect this with the almost parallel issue being thrown on the South China Sea, that a lot of the regional flashpoints that we are facing, particularly in the South China Sea dispute, the West Philippine Sea, maritime and territorial conflicts and tensions, had something to do with intrusions of other actors. So as being the Philippines, how could we successfully navigate those kinds of discourses that this is something that the West should not get involved to, and this is the best situation in furthering Philippine national security? Ambassador De Rosario, please.
All right. That is dividing people on this issue. It's whether you are pro-US or whether you are pro-China. You know, I keep on talking about not presenting this issue as an either-or issue, okay? Because I see the region really as not just whether it should be under the control of the US, under the control of the Chinese. one of the things also that I think I also blame ourselves about that, because we have not been very clear about how we want to move forward. When people talk about the role that we could have played in, pushing for the rule of law, meaning not the rule of law as defined by one side or the other, but the rule that came out from the arbitral ruling. They say, okay, could you not have used that really to promote some aspects of the law of the sea? And we somehow wasted time that we could have really gathered our allies and discussed this. Even China and us, okay, if you don't agree with this, what can we do? Because we cannot allow one country to undo, what other countries support. And that really requires a lot of diplomatic skills, a lot of coordination with our allies. The other thing also is we also have to look at the fact that the Philippines is not alone in the region. There are a lot of interested countries here. I talked at one point, I said, let us look at Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand, and even India. And of course, ASEAN. How do we see this? And shouldn't we take a look at this? And also in a way too, somehow some people think that the US should have been clearer also about its position, because I remember people keep on asking, will the US really come to our rescue? Will the MDT be triggered? I think it was more of a question on how much will the US risk in the region? How much investment to keep peace in the region? Then at the same time too, perhaps, as some people say, we really have to understand China. I think there are some of us who have not really studied the whole strategic philosophy of China. People are talking about the 100-year marathon that China hopes will be completed in 2049. And people are talking about China being the premier military and naval power by 2049. So these are the things that we should consider as we try to work around with our allies and with everybody who's involved in the region, without us necessarily being seen as neglecting one side or the other, because otherwise we might be back in the mindset of the Cold War. Thank you.
Dr. Winger?
I think that's a really, really interesting and really excellent question. I tend to push back against the narrative of the West is to blame, not because it's not complicit, not because of not reasons why it, but also because it seemingly denies agencies to specific actors like China and Russia, who have more than capable of making up their own minds and taking strategic decisions and strategic actions. The one thing that I think very much links Western culpability in the current situations in the South China Sea and Ukraine is a common flaw that was the optimism of the 1990s and the early 2000s. That in both situations, especially the United States and Europe, believed that economic engagement, capitalism, will lead to political reforms and moderations in both Russia and China. And that didn't happen. There was the belief that, just through trade and engagement, that the Cold War, like the end of history, Francis Fukuyama mentality, was going to lead to changes and progress in Russia and China that would somehow erase all these difficult political and geopolitical questions. And that didn't happen. The political reforms did not take root in Russia. It backslid. Same in China, we were seeing. And that's also where the failures of the West, I think, came into it, is that we didn't arrive at 2022 by mistake. That there have been way markers along the way that have shown the evolution of China and Russia as strategic powers and strategic actors in the South China Sea, in Eastern Europe. And when those unfolded, especially in the early 2000s, not enough was probably done to hold them to account for that. In the case of Russia, you look at the Second Chechen War. what happened? Brutal human rights question, but this was the global war on terrorism. So what can you do? 2008, you have the Russo-Georgian War. The Obama administration comes out with the reset button. The same is also true in the South China Sea. It's the cabbage strategy, the salami strategy, the gradual erosion of norms. And maybe if there had been more action done at the earlier points, we wouldn't have gotten here for both actors, or at the very least, that may have caused a change of strategic dynamics. It's probably too late to rethink those now, but I do think it is useful to think of what are the alternative pathways now in terms of regional engagements, in terms of reestablishing some of these norms, and making sure that they'll actually adhere to, not just by the United States. This is not a Western world order thing. This is a rule of law thing, especially at the international level. Thank you.
Yeah, Aris may also pick up from what Greg was talking about. You know, when the US decided to really invest in China, it so happened that I was assigned in Washington, D.C. And at that time, the mindset was, if you help develop China, eventually it will also develop its democratic outlook, meaning you make people comfortable enough, improve them economically, and then later on, they will yearn for democratic values, right? And we also use that for Myanmar. Isn't it our constructive engagement? We said, okay, let's have Myanmar become better. It didn't work because some people now realize that you can have both, meaning you can have economic development and you can have a strong control from the government. Now, one thing that is really regrettable right now, in the past, when China was not yet that developed, the US was able to balance Russia and China. In fact, the two were even competing against each other. But now, since China is so strong economically and also in a way militarily, it can afford to act without the United States. And so now the two are closer to each other, leaving the US alone on one side. And so to us, it has become a more precarious situation because you have two big powers together, working together. In fact, some people say that the sanctions against Russia will not work because China will help Russia circumvent them. And of course, China can provide all the things, more or less, that Russia will need without the need of Western countries.
Thank you, Ambassador De Rosario and Dr. Winger. There are a few questions on cybersecurity. I want to pull them together. I think they're mostly from our participants from Mindanao. Thank you very much for these questions. And it has something to do, and I think Dr. Winger can address this because there's a specific question for Ambassador De Rosario later on mining. For Dr. Winger, what could be specific types of functional or detailed cooperation on cybersecurity between the Philippines and the US? And connected to this, how could this cooperation be really implemented or be really substantive given problems related to bureaucracies in both countries, as well as how downloading these policies at the national to the local level will work? And sorry if it's a triple-barreled question. In terms of, I think, cybersecurity cooperation, would bilateral approaches work, or should we really do multilateral and engage also for the Philippines on cybersecurity cooperation, let's say at the regional or at the level of ASEAN? Dr. Winger?
It's a lot of questions, but the great questions. I want to just thank all the participants for them because they're fantastic questions. I'll start with kind of the easier one, the bureaucracy question. I desperately wish I had a good answer for that one. If I could figure out a way to solve government bureaucracy issues, I mean, that would be amazing. What I will say with cyber is we are in a situation where, on one hand, we are developing new government institutions, both in the Philippines and the United States, to deal with cyber. And as we develop those bureaucracies, it's important to think through what they are and start embedding key institutional norms and practices within it. So, for example, cooperation is essential for cybersecurity, but it's also really hard. A lot of cybersecurity, effective cybersecurity, it involves don't trust people. It's why we don't share passwords. It's why we encrypt networks. So developing trusting relationships is really hard and in many ways kind of the opposite of good cybersecurity practices. But the more you can establish institutional links, and especially establish personal links within bureaucracies and between bureaucracies, is going to make it much easier to work together in these low trust areas. That's true at the national level in terms of just getting different parts of governments to work together, which is really tough a lot of the times. It's true in terms of the public-private level of trying to reach out to business communities, to the education community, to establish effective relationships. And it's absolutely true at the international level where things like information sharing is critical. Start thinking about that cooperation now and start beginning those practices now so that when you need them, when something bad happens, you have that network in place of people who know and trust each other who can respond effectively. In terms of practical points of cooperation, especially in terms of the bilateral relationship, capacity building is a big one. Normally, when we think about capacity building, we're talking about ships, planes, and guns. In cybersecurity, it's people, knowledge, and programs. There are some institutional aspects. So, for example, helping develop a cyber range. Just like you have a firing range to test different types of conventional elements, a cyber range is a localized, usually virtual machine networks where you can practice incident response. You don't want to practice hunting malware on an actual computer because that's when bad things happen. And you've had people accidentally crash their networks. So a cyber range will do that. And then also working together through the AFP education, military education programs to develop cyber education and training programs for military personnel, civilian responders, law enforcement, that's a huge one. Learning best practices as you build those out is where it can be really useful. And lastly, the question is not just cyber at a bilateral level, but a regional level. Absolutely, unquestionably. The issue, what we're dealing with cybersecurity is this is something new in the world. This is a largely human constructed ungoverned space. This is something that no one state, no two states are ever going to be able to manage together. Working together at the bilateral level, the regional level, the global level is the only way we get out of this. So establishing we have tons of norms in international relations. We have tons of international laws. How do you build those in cybersecurity? How do you translate existing laws into cybersecurity? That's something where ASEAN could be incredibly influential. That's something where the United Nations could be involved. Thinking through not just what is the current situation, but potential threats, potential future bad things that can come out of cyber, starting to put in place treaties, agreements, norms, standards, practices, things like how you handle extraditions of cyber criminals. That kind of stuff is essential to build out the rule of law in cyberspace, and that absolutely is multilateral negotiations and cooperation.
Yeah. By the way, Greg, does the Philippines have a focal point on cybersecurity? Do we have that?
Which type of security?
Okay. I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Of information communication technology, or the ICT, was not formed to take care of cybersecurity, is it?
So in the Philippines, it's kind of a mixed bag. So the elements in the AFP, there's elements in law enforcement, but the key institution is the ICT, Department of Information Communication Technology, which is still fairly new and developing. And they are kind of the main focal point of it in terms of helping to navigate between, especially at the national level. Yes. And as I think what's really essential is as that institution develops, starting to build in this international cooperation elements. And this is also true in the United States. For example, the Department of Homeland Security was founded after 9/11 as crisis response to terrorism. It's extremely expanded its cybersecurity capabilities. There's a new I always tripped up on the acronym. It's the CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which I think is a clear parallel to DICT. And what is essential is now you have these two agencies, DICT and CISA, have a lot in common, but they're both domestically focused. If you could start building those relationships between them, there could be a lot of value added from that in both directions, to be honest.
Okay. I want the next question to be addressed by Ambassador de Rosario. There is an issue with how best the Philippines can push, or at least maybe the next administration can push for mining and the use of natural resources in the pursuit of its national security and national development. Do you think it's vital that the Philippines pursue and what should be its mining policy in the next few years?
Okay, that issue really has been there for maybe about 10 years, the mining issue. You see, the problem right now is that because we have no consolidated mining policy and also how to address our mining as part of national development, mining permits now are being granted by local government units. So it's almost like, they do their own thing and they grant mining permits to every little entity that comes from abroad. And so they cannot also control the quality of operations, the quality of mining. Definitely, we cannot just close the possibility of mining as being part of our national development. There have been studies saying that our nickel production alone is very important, that if we just focus on nickel alone, it could really help us pay our national debt or something, assuming that there is no corruption involved, that there is no pollution. We contract responsible mining companies. And definitely, as I said, if investors now are looking at clean energy, at clean operations, they will not really they call that support operations that will go into dirty mining. So I hope that the next administration will focus on how you can consolidate all these operations so that not everyone, from Bicol to to the Ilocos region and even in Palawan, they do their own mining operations based only on the mayor and what the mayor is paid, what the municipality is paid by the mining company. And then the other one is this related. There's another related question to that. Is there, Aris, or is it just mining?
Yeah, for now it's just mining. I think this has something to do with, one of the questions that were posed to presidential candidates is actually their positions on mining. So I think some of our participants are very much interested on learning how our mining policy will likely evolve in the coming years and whether our mining policy can be effectively linked with our security policy and even our foreign policy.
Yes. Yes, definitely. I think, as I said, that's why like if you're going, like for instance, there are some governments who have an institution that really vets investments, whether they are dangerous to the national security or not. Like even a big country as the United States, nobody can just invest in their ports, because to them ports are very essential to national security. There was one Arab country who is up to now a friendly country, who wants to invest in a port near New Jersey and New York, and somehow the U.S. government did not grant that permission, claiming that one can never tell whether a friend now will be an enemy later. So in other words, they said no investments in ports. I think we should also take a look at that. I mean, just as Greg is talking about cybersecurity, let's look at our own coastlines, as our own geographic configuration. What are the weak points for attack for us in this sense?
Okay, thank you very much, Ma'am Lula. We have a question on a lot of our participants have alluded to, or at least directly asked questions on um, the likely positioning of the Philippines on the intensifying US-China rivalry. So there are questions about how best to traverse this intensified rivalry. So I think my question to both would be, where do you think this rivalry is heading, and is the Philippines equipped? Will the new administration be equipped to handle this better than before? Because we can always improve our foreign relations with countries. I know this is a very forward-looking question, but I want to ask first Greg and then Ambassador Lula, where this rivalry do you think is heading? Will it and how could the Philippines be better prepared? How could the next administration be better prepared than previous administration in placing itself within this rivalry in our strategic environment?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It's a very tough question. And I mean, you never come to a political scientist expecting optimism, and I'm not optimistic. I mean, it's a tough situation. I don't see it getting better anytime soon. I think that the new catchphrase in DC is strategic competition. And I think that's a realistic expectation of what to think about what's coming in the future for this relationship. I am not convinced yet that it's going to necessarily escalate to a major militarized conflict, though that's absolutely possible. But the idea of increasing decoupling economically, politically into separate camps, more akin to what we saw in the Cold War, I think that's very likely. It's fundamental differences. And the role of the Philippines, and I think this is essential, is one of the key differences between the United States and China within that strategic competition is the presence and the role of allies. The United States has a large network of allies who, both in Europe and Asia, who have a seat at the table, who are willing to cooperate with the United States. China typically does, if you look at its international relations, it certainly has clients. I am not necessarily sure that's the same as allies. That's true both within ASEAN. They have a good relationship with Pakistan. Well, the Russia thing is awkward, but it exists. And what I think is essential with that is the ability of the United States not just to frame this as China, the United States. I think if we talk about strategic competition in like a boxing terms of one versus the other, it misses the larger point here. What we are talking about is what's the future of international relations? What's the future of the liberal world order? And the role of American allies like the Philippines to push the United States, to be clear on this, to push the United States to frame its own agenda in terms of the rule of law internationally, a kind of collective free trade agreements, actual separation between state and the economy, and towards especially democracy, the idea of a democracy summit that President Biden had, that's key. And I think the ability of allies like the Philippines to have a seat at the table and to push the United States to take into consideration the role of small states, of middle powers, of countries caught in between, and so that the United States does frame its own agenda and actually stands behind it, I think will be essential.
Okay. For us in the Philippines, it's very hard because we are a weak country. Some people say we're even a weak state. And somebody has mentioned Singapore. The reason why Singapore can manage to deal with both, because it's so strong. As soon as Lee Kuan Yew came into power, he really focused on human resources, that they develop their people, that they educate them. And then later on, they put on very strict laws on governance, on accountability. So if we put this, just the fact that we don't have accountable politicians, we don't have accountable bureaucrats, we can be really susceptible to corruption. And that's why we are easily attacked, not necessarily from our shores or from our airspace, but our people themselves are sources of insecurity. So why don't we develop our people, make them believe in their country and not think that the best way to escape the problem is to immigrate abroad. And to me, sometimes they keep on criticizing me why I keep on talking about immigration or against immigration. It's not that. It's our country should be good enough so that people will not think of leaving the country. In fact, the good ones should really be encouraged to stay and say, why don't we develop our country? Why don't we develop our human resources? Why don't we develop our bureaucracy, so that at least later on, if we are strong as a people, then perhaps we cannot just be taken for granted by any country. And then if we stand strong with our allies, we have to choose well whom we want to stand with. Because if we keep on vacillating, nobody will trust us.
Right.
As in anything, if people know what you stand for and that you're strong enough in your principles, people will be attracted to you.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Lula, for reinforcing what I think really has been our default foreign policy position. And for the longest time, the perception of the international community of nations toward the Philippines. It's just unfortunate that there's been some changes, some observed perceived changes in that perception, but we can bring it back. We can, because we're really known as a country that stands for multilateralism, human rights, international law, and no 6-year administration, I think, can totally undermine that. And but thank you also for bringing up Singapore, because I think the question on how Singapore has successfully managed it, I think, might be overestimated. We know how Singapore is currently struggling because Beijing has been double downing on Singapore for its very friendly stance on Taiwan. So in other words, small states, even those who are successful in trying to outmaneuver the two elephants, despite being grass, also have limitations. And Singapore's case actually have shown that it's not able to successfully juggle. And sometimes it pushes a little bit far. Therefore, the superpowers would put it back to, hey, you're really testing the limits of this hedging strategy that you are undertaking. The next question is Garcio from the National Security Council. Hi, Clarice. COVID-19 has highlighted how interconnectivity can wreak havoc in our internal security environment, particularly the economy. In the Philippines, our National Economic and Development Authority suggests it will take 40 years for us to fully recover. Do you think there is a need to rethink the economic strategies of the country, taking into consideration the impact of COVID? So I think that's a very important question that not only all of us are interested, but given the upcoming elections, this is one of the central economic, if not central, issues that the new government will face after the May elections. Maybe Ambassador Lula can address it.
Yeah. First of all, be honest with the facts. Because right now, we don't know whether we are on alert 2, or we should be in alert 2, or we should be on alert 3 level. Because I think there's such a lack of trust on the information coming from all around that people can be misled into thinking that everything is fine. Yesterday, I just got an email from somebody in the medical profession saying that things are not really that spiffy in the Philippines, that things have not improved as far as the pandemic is concerned. And then there is now news that was sent to me saying that there's now an Omicron variant 2, and it's deadlier than the Omicron variant 1. Now, if we keep on telling people that it's fine, we're also trying to undermine our own, as I said, our own capability, because later on, if it were a fire, if we're not aware that there's really a fire going on in the neighborhood, pretty soon it might really overwhelm us. So we have to start with that. And even our own medical profession should really stand up and say, we're sorry, but we're standing together as physicians, as medical practitioners, frontliners. This is what is happening. So we have to start with that. Then later on, we'll see what we can do, because able to move forward.
Dr. Winger, do you have something to add on pandemic recovery and how it will be an important issue in the coming years?
Yeah, this is going to take a while. I just want to echo, that was a fantastic answer. And I mean, I have many friends in the medical profession, and right now everyone's complaining about the tired of the restrictions, the tired of wearing masks. If you want to talk about tired, talk to a nurse, a doctor who's been dealing with this every single day for the past 2 years. They're just exhausted, and it's a difficult problem, and we need to take the information seriously that there are all threats out there. There are simple steps that we can take to help mitigate this. And before we even start, absolutely echoing, before we start talking about recovery, we actually need to get through this. And once we do actually make it through it, take lessons learned from this about the spread of medical disinformation and take action so that the next time this happens, both economically, medically, we're in a better position to help navigate this. Because I don't think certainly not in the United States, we have not handled this well administratively at all. And there are important lessons there for how the publics and the government interact with each other, as well as with specialty professions like the medical field.
Thank you for those responses. We have around more or less 12 minutes more for our Q&A. We thank our participants for putting their questions in the chat box. We encourage our participants to ask those, lay them to our two speakers. There is a question about from Neil Silva, attorney Neil Silva. Given the interconnectedness of financial markets, their vulnerability after fiscal and monetary decisions during the pandemic, and the increased ability and willingness of revisionist states to use financial and other economic disincentives, how can the Philippines and other states enhance the resilience of their domestic financial systems without decoupling from the global financial and trading system? I think Ambassador Lula, would you like to?
That's hard. You know, we're so coupled. In fact, right now, unless things have changed because of the situation in Ukraine, and I think some people know this, that the United States Federal Reserve Chairman has been mulling about the possibility of raising interest rates. Okay, once they do that, once the dollar starts to earn more money in terms of interest rates, expect a lot of movement from investments in the Philippines, especially those who are in the stock market, to move out and go to the US where the earnings are more. So definitely, unfortunately, because everything is tied to the dollar, we cannot really be uncoupled or decoupled. So I did not mention that, about the interest rate movements in the US as affecting us, because I'm not sure where they are right now. But definitely anything that the Federal Reserve Chairman does, it affects the Philippines. Thank you.
Okay. Unless Greg has something to add, or okay. There are a couple of questions here that tries to seek your opinion on whether the country needs a separate department to handle threats to homeland security. I've been asked a lot about this because I also teach handle some modules at the Philippine Public Safety College. Do we need such? Like in the US, there is a Department of Homeland Security that somehow federal level agency that concentrates a lot of the more domestic oriented threats. Is this something that could improve the national overall security situation in the Philippines? That if we create and rationalize a separate Department of Homeland Security?
It's interesting. I think I might have answered this question differently probably about 10 years ago. One of the things I've come around on Department of Homeland Security about is that it plays an essential role as a coordinating body for domestic security threats. That when you think about external threats, yeah, you have the Department of National Defense, the Department of Defense in the United States, and that's the central clearinghouse for all kinds of external actions. Domestically, though, we were talking, and actually, I just found that the question about mining to be very interesting, fascinating. And there's a similar issue with security. You think about how many different agencies and actors are at play in domestic security concerns, from law enforcement, regional authorities, to governmental different agencies. You have different subsectors of different bureaucracies. Who is actually coordinating between them to make sure that they actually work well together, that they coordinate their actions, and also not just work between different government agencies and different levels, but also engage proactively with critical infrastructure providers in healthcare, in energy production, in like just sewage, water. Who's actually doing that? In the United States, the answer was no one prior to 9/11. Now it's the Department of Homeland Security. Now, does there need to be a entirely new bureaucracy to try and do that? That's a give or take. That's an institutional design flaw. Or can you take an existing institution and reform its mandates and help start building those networks? I think that's more of preferences, and I tend to lead on the side of adding more layers of bureaucracy on top of layers of bureaucracies on how you waste resources. But I do think there is that central mission of coordinating between different domestic actors. Ports were mentioned earlier, fantastic point. Who's coordinating ports, shipping, all these things, and then helping to establish policy norms and practices. I think that is a very useful thing. And again, if we talk about whole of nation, you need some actor who's actually going to do that.
I agree with Greg, because I think you can tackle it from the point of view of management. Like how do you coordinate all the departments when it comes really to going to whole of government approach? I'll give you a real example. You know, the DENR is committed to keeping our promise in the Paris Accord on climate change and about us somehow minimizing our emissions. And then as soon as we made our commitment there, the Department of Energy approved the opening of coal operated plants. So I said, what's happening? It's as though you have a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in government. The other one doesn't know. So how can we reach our commitment in the Paris Accord of reducing our emission if our Department of Energy is doing the contrary thing? So to look at all the issues, almost all issues are interrelated. And then how can cabinet meetings be done? I know there was an attempt one time at the NEDA level, the National Economic Development Authority level, and there was a meeting. There is a particular committee there that tries to integrate all the issues that really impact on different aspects of our lives. But I just want to know, is NEDA the one that should be doing that? I appreciated that, but at the same time, will the other cabinet ministries respect, for instance, the chairmanship of NEDA? Because sometimes, the cabinet ministers also have their own attitude about who takes precedence over whom, right? The presidents of the ranks also count. But definitely, we cannot do a whole of government approach, and we cannot really solve our problems without creating new ones as we solve others without really getting a coordinating council of sorts. Maybe, Aris, that's where you can come in and your specialization on coming up with this structure that will really help everybody up to the local government level. Now, there was a question about education. How do we start it? Sorry. I hate to say this, okay? Why don't we start with the Constitution and change the requirement for the president candidates? Why is there no educational requirement for them? Because some people will say, I can be president even if I don't finish college, so why bother? Our values are themselves reflected in our Constitution. So we have to do something also about that and the dynasty law and everything else. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ambassador. As someone who teaches Philippine politics, every time we discuss qualifications for the presidency, I always tell my students not to look at the exact constitutional provisions, but actually look at the articles in the Constitution that lays down what the powers and responsibilities of the president are. Because, if in any job advertisement, You have eligibility and you have responsibilities. Yes, you could be eligible, but can you handle the responsibility? So oftentimes I tell my students, if you are running for president and you read the powers of the president, and if you can't really perform them with a level of competence and integrity, then you might be eligible, you might be qualified to run, but you're not qualified to handle the position. So, but yes, an educational qualification, we've seen some countries impose this. I do think the debate here has something to do with the theory of democracy, that putting educational qualifications will limit the pool. It will not give the principle of democracy, of being able to rule and be ruled satisfied. So this is I'm sure a lot of debates have happened here. But let me go to the last question that I will ask. The idea of the upcoming elections, everyone is saying that this is critical. This will likely influence not just the next 6 years, but possibly beyond that. So as someone who have studied and have really a long experience, not only in the study, but also the practice of Philippine politics and security policy, the last question has something to do with what are the prospects of Philippine national security improving and being in a better situation given the likely outcomes or the likely scenarios after elections in May 2022. I'll ask Greg first and reserve the second response from Ambassador Lula.
So I've become very, very wary of predicting election results after November 2016. Got that one very, very wrong. But one of the things I think is important, especially when we talk about national security, is do elections matter 100%? The key players, the political elites are essential. They're key decision makers. But we shouldn't lose sight of the rest of the government as well. The key figureheads might change, but we need to focus on national bureaucracies, civil services, key institutional actors, and their ability to support and sustain national security, regardless of who's in the White House or Malacanang. And I think that's the key element. And as much as we talk about, obviously the presidents and vice presidents, it's more important, I feel, to assess the value and the strength of the institutions, of the bureaucracies, to respond to threats, to respond to challenges, to respond to new incidents. And I feel that as much as COVID-19 has taken a toll, let's be clear on that. It's taken a toll on institutions, coordinations, a lot of practices, and recovering from that is going to be a major challenge just to get back up to where we were 2 years ago. On top of that, though, I think we've also seen a dramatic resilience in national security institutions to adapt to changes. And I think that's positive, because we're in a time of change in international security, and that we have seen evidence of institutions, and especially the national security state, to identify and respond to problems and to do so fairly effectively. That's encouraging, not because it's always going to work, but at least has that ability.
Ambassador?
Okay, definitely the bureaucracy will play a very significant role. And I think we have enough of them who are concerned enough to say, okay, let's cobble something together and present it to the president, and it doesn't matter who the president is. What worries me are the cabinet ministers, because they use their department or ministry to earn money from. Like I know from DENR cabinet minister who granted so many logging permits during his term that in effect, he himself, undermined his own reason for being, the reason for DENR. And then, of course, assuming that you have, I'm not alluding that this is happening, assuming that there's somebody who is in the Department of Education, okay, who is using his influence to determine what kind of textbooks should be used in the public schools. That will already undermine the quality of our education, the kind of thinking that our people will have. So you can have an incomplete history, you can have, things that will favor one publisher over another, or even public health. What if you have somebody there who is using the hospital system and all the procurement system to enrich himself, thereby, undermining our own health security. So ultimately, definitely, we can go with our National Security Outlook program for the next 20 years if we want to. But if we don't put the right people in place, nothing will happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Del Rosario. Thank you, Dr. Winger. I think your final responses to the last question can hopefully guide our participants, because I assume that a lot of us here will cast their vote on May 9th, and to think that we are not just electing a president and a vice president should be on the basis of competence and track record, but also a discernment that these top two officials will likely appoint or have a hand in appointing thousands of people in key positions that will likely determine the trajectory of our foreign and security policies, at the very least in the next 6 years, at the most beyond that. So on behalf of all the participants and the
Aris,
organizers.
Aris, sorry.
Go ahead.
Before you say goodbye, may I just acknowledge the presence of Undersecretary Ambassador Rosario Manalo?
Oh,
She was my mentor.
for
I
sure.
mean, I learned a lot from her. I just want to acknowledge her publicly and what she has done for me. Okay.
Thank you
And I
very
also,
much.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I want to acknowledge, of course, the presence of Ambassador Minda Cruz. We were together when she was in the China issue. She was under fire. I mean, all the time because of that. Thank you very much for attending.
I apologize for not being able to recognize our distinguished ambassadors who are currently in the participants. I know that Ambassador Betita is also here. And we also have a lot of bureaucrats, public servants, members of the Philippine security sector, as well as participants from Mindanao who are here. So we thank you very much for spending the time and for participating in this webinar. So with that, I formally end this webinar with a few announcements. As you may know, this is part of the Strategic Situationer series. So there will be other webinars in this series in the coming weeks or months. We invite you to follow the Facebook page of both the Foundation for the National Interest and FACTS for announcements. FACTS also has a website that contains a lot of research, analysis, op-eds, as well as other information that could be relevant as far as foreign policy and security policy is concerned. So the website is factsasia.org. And with that, I formally end and thank all the participants. There is an evaluation survey that we ask you to accomplish for our participants, and please accomplish this so that you are able to get a certification of attendance for your own purposes. So we hope to see you in our future webinars. Have a good day. Please be safe, and we will all see you soon. This is Aris Arugay of the Foundation for the National Interest, and good morning.